I would ask you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. If you don't know where Genesis is, it's the very first book in the Bible. And then you just keep turning the pages to chapter 15. If you're still not sure, look in the index in your Bible. We are beginning a new series today. There's a concept in the Bible that I think has been lost over time. It's been lost to time. And it's a place found many times in biblical stories that has little or no meaning to modern readers, and that is the altar. And so we are going to start a 4-week series on the altar, what it means to meet with God and for God to alter our life. And so today starts that, and I want to give us a brief history of the altar as well as to challenge us to return to the altar once again. And our key passage here is in Genesis chapter 15, and I would like to read it, and then we will go through and explain how this connects. We're going to start in verse 9, but let me give you a little bit of a backstory here. Abraham's having this conversation with God back and forth, and Abraham liked to try to argue with God, or he complained to God and give God excuses of why things God said can't happen now. And God would answer him, and finally God got to the point of verse 9. Actually, back to verse 5, he said, listen, I promise you an heir. I promise that you are going to become a great nation. Abraham's like, I'm old and I don't even have a kid yet. And God finally took him outside and said, look to the sky, count the stars. If you are able to count them, that's how much your offspring will be numbered. Have you ever tried counting the stars at night? That's a lot. But verse 6 says a key change in Abraham says Abram believed the Lord and it was credited to him for righteousness. Now we get down to verse 9. This is where God's meeting with Abraham to seal the deal, so to say. So follow along as I read verse 9 through 18. And he said to him, bring a 3-year-old cow, bring a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So he brought all these to him, cut them in half, laid the pieces opposite of each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain. Your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation that they serve, and afterwards they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace, and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquities of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared, passed down between the divided animals, and on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Now, this today is supposed to be a brief history of the altar. And this is going to challenge us, but I want to give a little context here. This is not the first time that we see sacrifice and we see a covenant or a promise between God and man. We're going to get back to that point in a minute. But this goes all the way back. The idea of the altar as a place of sacrifice goes all the way back to Genesis, when Adam and Eve sinned against God and failed. Like all of us do, we are all sinners and we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. When that happened, God provided a sacrifice to cover them, to cover their sins. And the sacrificial system was set up, that then God instructed them to make sacrifices, not only once when they did recognize sin in their own lives, but they also had to give a sacrifice once a year just in case. Not like they didn't recognize the sin already, but just in case they had to give a sacrifice to God. And God met people there. God would do something at the altar. And this was significant because the altar was, in fact, a place where God would do something with his people. So here's the brief little history. I mean, we're going to cover this at how high planes fly over, Kansas. That's how high we're probably going to go with the altar view right here. Because if we got into the details, we could spend a long time looking at this. So here's the high view of the altar. In the Old Testament, there were numerous places where people would build an altar and make sacrifices to God. And there were basically two types of altar. There was one, the stone or the earthen altar. These were taken from stones that were uncut, unfinished, just found on the ground, and they were stacked up to build a place of sacrifice, a place of meeting with God. And these stones would then stay as a place of remembrance for the people who made the sacrifice. In the old era of the Middle East, you would walk around fields and you would just find these piles of stones. And if someone knew who made the sacrifice, they would tell the story. Otherwise, you just knew that something happened there. Then there was not only the stone altar or the stone, the place where it was used by the average person, but there was a temple altar as well. So where the stone altar was uncut, unfinished, unpolished, it was a crude structure made to sacrifice to God. The temple altars were made from precious metals, from precious polished stones. It was a specific shape. It had specifications. I didn't know if they had building inspectors back then, but if there was one, they would measure to make sure it met all the specifications before they could use it. The stone altars, it was anything and everything you could do just to build it up. The temple altars, they were perfect. And these were made by skilled craftsmen, used for only priests and temple use only. So these were used for ceremonies, and these were used for significant moments with God and his people. Now in the New Testament, we transition over. The altar is not mentioned all that much. Matter of fact, one of the key places is when Paul is preaching in Athens, and he preaches about the altar to the unknown God. And so it becomes more of a metaphor. And it's highlighted by Revelation, where it says that the prayers of believers is like a sweet aroma of the altar. Now, going back in the Old Testament, there were multiple different types of altars. There was the altar of sacrifice. There was the altar of incense. I think there was another altar as well. But this is referring to our prayers as an altar of incense. It was a sweet aroma. Not saying that your prayers are dead, but that they are a sweet aroma, something that God actually enjoys listening to, hearing, and responding to as well. And so the New Testament, the altar becomes more of a metaphor or a symbol of meeting with God. Now in church history, the communion table was first known as the altar In the 2nd century, that was known whenever you got together with other believers to have communion, to have the Lord's Supper, that was then the altar. Whatever table the elements were placed on, that was called the altar. And it was just any table that they could find. Now, most churches over the last couple of decades have had similar tables like this. This do in remembrance of me, carved on them as a table of remembrance for the communion, for the Lord's Supper. But this was a place where people would make a spiritual decision, and that's where it transitioned from not only the communion table or the Lord's Supper table, but it also became the place during revivals, people would come forward to the altar. Have you ever heard of an altar call? Okay, where we call you to the altar. Now, we don't have necessarily a specific altar in our church, but most churches would use the front steps or the front row as an altar. This was a place where people come forward to make their spiritual decisions public. So whether they were coming to accept Jesus Christ and proclaim him as Lord and Savior of their life, they would come forward to the altar, the front of the church, to make their decision known. Or if they were coming for baptism, they would come forward, meet with a pastor or a deacon or a church leader to make their decision to follow in baptism known. If they were called to ministry, talking to several pastors, they all have a significant moment where they walked forward to make their decision to follow Christ in their calling to become pastors known. And it was significant. It was at the altar, the front of the church, that this happened. All these places, all these historical significance have one theme, though. The altar was a place to meet with God. The altar was a place to meet with God. And so, again, this is a concept that now has become lost in time, kind of lost to historical significance. Because now, most churches that you go to, you make your spiritual decisions in the seat. You might fill out a card or respond after a service to a pastor or something on the way out about your spiritual decision, but very rarely do people come forward anymore. And it's not just in our church, it's in a lot of churches I've been in. Probably you as well. So the point is that an altar doesn't have to necessarily be a specific place, a location necessarily, or it doesn't have to be like on the steps of the stage of a church, but an altar is a place special where you do meet with God. It needs to be something different, something that stands out. I'm not saying we get a whole bunch of rocks and put them up here for you to come and kneel at the altar like the songs say. But what I do want to point out is that throughout all of history, whenever someone met with God, they had a significant moment with God, they built an altar. Abraham built several altars throughout his story. Altars where he remembered meeting with God in that place. And this was a significant one, even though an altar is not specifically mentioned, it is an altar moment. And we'll get there. But I want you to think back. Many of you probably have core memories of an altar moment. A time of a mile marker, a significant change in your spiritual life that you made as a Christian, and the altar was the place where you made it. It is imprinted on your heart. If you think back to those moments in your life, where was that altar? Where was that moment with God? I remember that I led several youth camps for many years. I've lost track of how many years I led youth camps. And I remember at one camp specifically, the building that we were meeting in was getting old and ran down. And it was probably going to need to be tore down to be rebuilt. But that caused a huge stir in the people. Because that was a place, that room was a significant place for many of those. I think that building was somewhere around 75 years old and it had never been kept up. But I would meet with those people that had been there for years and years, and they would tell me about the moment up at the front of this chapel, and they would talk about the tear-soaked wood at the altar. Those core memories imprinted where there was something significant, something special that happened with you and God at that moment. These are big moments of our lives. But I remember from my own personal life, there were some times that when I met with God, that place became an altar, even though it wasn't in the front of a chapel or the front of a church. There was just as many tears poured out there, or just as significant a moment where I was crying out to God and God answered me in that moment. And that became an altar. What we need to remember is it's not necessarily the place or the structure, but it's the meeting with God. See, there were times that Israel and the story of God's people, they would build an altar and it actually became an idol. They would talk about, we're doing this to worship God, but instead it became all about their pride or what they can accomplish. And God will call them out on their idol worship. I'm not talking about an altar in a church nowadays as being a place of idol worship, where we over spiritualize the place. But what I want to do is I want to recognize the moment, the place where we meet with God. See, that altar moment is significant because there is something that happens. There's an exchange that happens between you and God. When God meets you in a place, there is a moment where God says, this is what I'm going to do for you, and this is what I expect from you. An exchange. And we don't talk about that altar very much anymore. But in this text, Abraham, later, his name gets changed. Abram meets with God, and it's a significant moment. We don't see any structure being built in this text. We know that he does build altars later and earlier in his story. But in this moment, we don't hear about an altar being built, but yet it is still an altar moment. Because he makes the animal sacrifice, which to ancient Middle East was a very significant moment. And so he made the animal sacrifices. And I read even this morning a devotion on this concept of having that altar. They pointed out, and I'll give you this to you, it's a freebie of today's message, okay? So I'm not even going to charge you for it. But when Abram was here and we see that the scavenger birds, the birds that, where is it? 11, birds of prey, that's where it is. Scavenger birds came down and they started to try to eat the carcass. Abram had to watch over his sacrifice. He had to be attentive to the moment. See, the world is going to have all kinds of things that try to distract us from an altar moment. But we have to be disciplined. We have to be aware. We have to be attuned to the moment and be careful not to get distracted. How many of you, when it comes time at the end of a service and you are having that reflection moment, that prayer moment, maybe for you it is an altar moment where you're praying and talking to God after hearing a sermon, and all of a sudden your brain gets flooded with all kinds of things that have nothing to do with God. Birds of prey, scavenger birds. They're trying to steal the moment of you meeting with God. That was the free one. That was where my devotion was this morning. But in our text, there is no altar mentioned, but there is the altar moment. And I want you to see, this is where we're going with the rest of the service, is that the altar is not only a place where we meet with God, but it also is a place of covenant with God. A place of covenant. In key points in the biblical narrative, God makes a covenant with his people. And often this was at a place of an altar. This is one of those key places that I want to highlight. Abram meets with God and God makes a covenant with him. I want you to hear that wording in the right way as well. God makes a covenant with his people. See, if we change the wording, his people make a covenant with God, then it's based on our ability to keep the covenant, to keep what we're promising. And a lot of times people come to the altar and they try to make promises to God. Out of whether it's good intentions or whether it's desperation or whatever it may be, they try to come to the altar or to have an altar moment and they try to say, God, if you just do this, I promise. I've heard some crazy stories. I promise I will commit the rest of my life to follow you. What they don't say is only when it's convenient. As long as you don't send me to Africa or to China or to another country, as long as I don't have to change anything, I promise, as long as you do this for me. Well, if it's based on us, that covenant doesn't stand a very good chance. Think about it this way. Many people don't understand the idea of covenant. So we have, in modern days, contracts. That's the closest thing to a covenant. It's not exactly the same, and we'll get there in a second. But a contract is kind of the same thing. An agreement between two parties. Well, if you're trying to make an agreement, a contract, to pay for your house, okay, you go into the bank and you are promising that you are going to pay back the money that you are borrowing to finish the house or to buy the house or whatever. Now, the bank, are willing to give you the money as long as you can prove you are going to be able to fulfill your side of the contract. That's why they run credit checks and history and all that kind of stuff. Okay? They want to know that you're going to be able to do it. If a covenant with God was based on our ability to fulfill the contract, God would say, not going to do it. Based on his history with Israel and God and his people that have throughout the Old Testament, they were the ones who constantly failed. God never failed. If it's based on ours, I don't know about you, but how many times have I failed God? Have I been unable to do what I've said I was going to do for God? How many times did I mess up? Well, God would not trust me to fulfill anything either. Now, God is the one who fulfills this covenant. God makes this covenant with his people, not his people with God. See, God is always faithful. God is able to keep his promises. He is able to do exactly what he says he's going to do. God never overpromises. Think of the covenant. It is different from the contract because it's based on a personal relationship. A covenant is more personal, more intimate, more detailed than a contract. Now, I know some contracts are extremely detailed. If you go to buy a car nowadays, the contract you have to fill out, the pages, and the print. Talk about fine print. The fine print has gotten finer, hasn't it? And it's not just our eyesights, but they actually print them smaller. But a covenant is a personal relationship between the two people that are making it. So this becomes an altar, a place of covenant between God and you, God and a person. And it becomes a real intimate, a real personal relationship now. Think of a marriage. A husband and wife enter into a formal relationship, binding themselves through vows that they are going to love each other. The old vows, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. It becomes a covenant, which is much different than a promise. This is the marriage covenant. And God here enters a covenant with Abram, that Abram, even though he's old and he doesn't think it's possible to have an offspring, God promises that he will make sure it happens. That God is the one going to provide the offspring that will lead to numerous descendants that outnumber the stars. In another place he talks about that it outnumbers the sand on the shore. And I know how sandy some of our beaches can get. I find thousands of sand particles when I get home, usually in my shoes. But the thing is, God promises, God makes the covenant. Abraham just believes. There are countless covenants that God has made with human beings. A lot of them you can read in text, but specifically, I want to highlight 5 of them that provide a narrative or a big overview of God's covenants with mankind. Going back to Genesis chapter 3, we know that God has made a covenant to cover our sins. But the first major formal agreement happens with Noah. God makes a covenant with Noah. Remember Noah's story? God got frustrated with all of mankind because they were doing what was evil, and they were extremely evil, rebelling against God and going against God's commands, God's ways. And God destroyed all mankind except for Noah and his family. And God made a covenant with Noah that he would not flood the earth again, no matter how evil humanity gets. Because I'm sure, looking back, he had to possibly think, man, I should have saved the flood till later. Because now would have been a good time to really flood the earth. But this covenant between God and mankind, all of creation, really, was finalized, was symbolized with the rainbow. That no matter how evil we got, God would not flood the earth again. Now, that's one of the things I want to highlight here, is that all of God's covenants are finalized, symbolized, they are remembered through something significant. A picture of that covenant, like the rainbow, that happens every time it rains. God displays his promise once again that he will not flood the earth. And Some of the other ones are symbolized or represented or finalized, is another way of doing it, by other symbols, other oaths, other significant moments. And that leads us to the second one here, and that's Abram's. Abraham's covenant that God gives him is that Abraham's family will bless all of the earth. That all of the earth's population are going to be blessed by Abram's descendants. God has to repeat this covenant with Abram several times because Abraham always had reasons why God couldn't do it. None of you are like that, are you? That you argue with God saying God's not able to do what he said? Okay. Abram had this promise from God, this oath from God, and it was sealed by this sacrifice, by this holy fire that comes through. And even though we don't see that it does, most scholars and most theologians will agree that this fire that passes through, the pot and the flaming torch, as they passed through these divided animals, it became a burnt offering. Those sacrifices were consumed by it as a symbol, as sealed, that sealed this covenant. It was a holy fire. And even though we don't make animal sacrifices, that holy fire still, God still sends down to seal his covenant with people. In Acts, after the resurrection of Jesus, the Spirit was sent down as a fire to seal his believers in this covenant. It is the same fire, it is the same Spirit as Abraham experiences here in 15. The next covenant that God makes with mankind is with Moses. We know this as Mount Sinai experience. Most refer to it as the Ten Commandments. That's where we get those. This is Moses up on the mountain as a representative for all of Israel, which Israel is Abraham's descendants. And so Moses is up there on behalf of Israel, and God makes the terms of this relationship, this intimate relationship between God and his chosen people, he makes those terms known. And that's where we do get the Ten Commandments, the Levitical law. And God's commandments are for us to keep. And God does make this one condition with this covenant. He simply makes the terms very clear. You keep my commandments and you will be blessed. You disobey my commandments and you will be cursed. Most notably, you could read that in Deuteronomy chapter 6. This covenant, though, is sealed, kind of made official, by something we don't really think about much, and that is the Sabbath. That we are supposed to keep one day a week holy as a sign of us obeying God's command. And God was going to keep his promises to bless all of earth through Abraham's descendants. Then we get the next covenant, the next big covenant that God makes with people, and that is with David. Now, we like to think of this one because, especially around Christmas time, we read the passages that God promises that there is going to be a descendant of David who was a descendant of Abraham, that David's descendants, one of them will become the eternal king who's going to establish a kingdom that will never end. See, going back, God's people, the Israelites, had gotten frustrated, and so they demanded God. They said, God, we want a human king. God always intended to be the king of Israel. God always intended to be the leader of his chosen people. They didn't need a human being to be the one to make decisions. God was going to be the one to do it. And then, so God chose Saul. Saul was Israel's first king. And he failed both the nation and God in an epic way. He meant to do what was good, but he failed miserably. And so God chose David to be the successor, to be Israel's second king. And David did something right at this moment. When he became king, he returned Israel back to worship God. He established the temple and the temple sacrifice again. And so he built that altar as a place to meet with God once again, and for God to meet with his people, and he established that. And God said, because of David's heart, that God was going to establish one of David's descendants as the eternal king, as the king that would rise up and last forever. See, all of these major covenants were building upon one another, and they were creating a theme. They were creating one narrative, one mega story. And in this, we see a couple of things. One, every single one of the humans failed on their part of the covenant. But the covenant was still kept because it was not based on human experience. It was based on God. And God is faithful. His word never returns void, meaning that it will always accomplish exactly what God has said it would. But see, Israel had forgotten and ignored their part of the agreement, their part of the covenant with God. Israel failed. God, however, intended to always keep his part of the covenant no matter what. And he finalizes this. He brings all those four major covenants together into one, known as the New Covenant. This new covenant is to be the everlasting covenant that fulfills all of the covenant. Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, all of those promises are kept and fulfilled in one covenant now. It is God combining all of them to make one final agreement. God will write his law on the hearts of his people. Not on stone anymore, but on our hearts. And will bring about complete forgiveness. Remember back in Genesis where God covered our sin. Now the new covenant will be a complete forgiveness of our sin. Not just a covering. The people under this new covenant will be blessed, and they will bless the world by following and introducing the world to the new king, the eternal king, Jesus Christ. God's covenant with Abraham, Moses, David culminates. It reaches the climax. It reaches the highest point in the story with Jesus Christ as the Messiah. The fulfillment of all the other oaths, all the other covenants are now in one. And Jesus even says that he is the new covenant. And so, this brings me back to the altar of covenants. Abram's altar here, even though we don't hear specifically his sacrifice, his meeting with God in this place is an agreement that Abraham will in fact believe God at his word. That is the covenant we need to have. We need to come to a place and recognize that God is holy, God is almighty, and he is choosing to meet with us now. He is choosing to come down and promise us something. The promise now under the new covenant is that if we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, we will be saved. We will be forgiven. We will now be God's people. We're not replacing Israel. That's a whole different teaching that is not true. But we are now included into the same promises. We are grafted into that being God's chosen people. And so a place where we meet God and we are brought into an intimate personal relationship with him through Jesus Christ, that is an altar of covenant. A place that becomes special and imprinted on our hearts. The altar became the place where people made and remembered their commitments to God. God makes promises. We say, here's our side of it. We're going to commit to trying to do this. Even though God knows we're going to fail, we're still going to be held to those commitments. God is going to be able to hold us to those and give us the strength to fulfill them. See, I think, I'm not talking about a place necessarily, but I am talking about the concept of an altar. We need to come back to the altar. We need to come back to a place where we offer our sacrifice, our prayers, our worship to the true God. Where we enter into a personal relationship with him. Many of you can remember the altar where you entered into that relationship with God through Jesus Christ. By simply saying, I believe in Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection as a covering for my sin. And God, I ask you to forgive me of my sins. That is entering into a covenant with him, the new covenant. But that's not the only time God makes a covenant with us. That's not the only place where God meets with us. God still meets with us today. We need to have an altar in our hearts where we formalize that relationship. We finalize that we are going to believe God for what he has said to us. Anytime God meets with us and we hear from God, it needs to become a place of an altar where we worship God and we allow God to alter our lives. To make those alterations. So when you meet with God, when God is in a moment, that becomes an altar moment.